Hello and welcome to this Institute for Government Events. How can the government help boost growth in the science-based industries? I'm Tom Pope, the Deputy Chief Economist here at the IFG, and I'm delighted to be hosting this event with the support of Novartis Pharmaceuticals. Now, Labour has made economic growth its driving mission in government, and a centrepiece of that plan will be its upcoming industrial strategy, due to be published in the summer. In the Green Paper, published last year, science and innovation feature prominently. Life sciences is identified as holding, and I quote, enormous potential to drive economic growth and productivity in the decades ahead. So how can we ensure that potential is fulfilled? How can the government ensure that this industrial strategy endures where previous ones have not? What role should science and technology play in the UK economy? And what's the role of government in fulfilling that ambition? And what should the balance in what government does be between directing science and technology explicitly towards economic growth, or indeed explicitly towards anything, versus other priorities like health and net zero? So to answer this and more, I'm delighted to be joined by a stellar panel here this afternoon. We have Lord Patrick Vallance, who is now Minister of State for Science, Research and Innovation. Johan Karlström, who's President and Managing Director UK and Ireland of Novartis Pharmaceuticals, who are supporting our event today. Amanda Walthausen, Vice President for Strategic Engagement and Chief of Staff to the President at Imperial College London, and my colleague Giles Wilkes, who is a Senior Fellow here at the IFG and also a former Special Advisor, who has lots of experience working on those past, no longer surviving iterations of industrial strategy, alas. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. There'll be plenty of time for questions after we've had some initial discussion. There'll be a roaming mic in the room, so please do put your hand up at that time and be thinking about your questions. If you're in the adjoining room, please pop your head around the door if you'd like to ask a question. And for those online, we've also got Slido, which should be in the panel just next to the screen that you're watching this on now, so please do start adding your questions there as well. We'll also be live tweeting this from @IFG Events using the hashtag industrial strategy, so please do join the conversation there if you'd like. And with that, I will get going, and I'll start, Lord Vallance, with you. The industrial strategy sectors, in particular life sciences, digital, advanced manufacturing, defence, are knowledge and science dependent, which should play into UK strengths. So what are the policies that we can deploy to boost growth in those areas?
Well, I mean, they do play to UK strengths, you're right, in terms of the academic and basic research space. And the challenge is how you turn that into companies that can be sustainable and grow. And that's been a long-standing challenge in the UK, so there's nothing new there. But there are things that can and should be done, and that's why the industrial strategy becomes such an important lever to do this. Because we know that we're now much better at startups than we were a decade ago, much, much better. We know that we are not succeeding on scale-ups to the extent we should be, and that itself presents a massive potential for lost opportunity. Because if we don't take those startups through into that, then we're going to increasingly lose the value. And we also know we've got some big companies here, both domestic and global, that are R&D intensive. So any solution needs to view this as a problem that has a number of parts to it. Yes, there's a funding question. How do we best use UKRI funding, Innovate UK funding to get this going? But they must be designed to leverage private sector investment. How do we release big scale-up capital? And that's why there's the focus on pension funds and other things to release large amounts of capital for the scale-up stage where we are definitely under-resourced. And if you look at the equivalents in the US, we do sort of not so well on the startups, and we do much, much worse on the scale-ups. And so getting that capital released and making sure that there are the skills to deploy that capital is obviously part of the policy answer. But it's not only the finance bit. We need to get the regulation right, and that's why we've announced the Regulatory Innovation Office to try and get a science and technology innovation regulatory system, because that kills many companies. Many small companies in some areas have to go to as many as 10 or 11 different regulators to get something through. That's almost impossible to do. We know that we need to get procurement right, because government procurement signals, and indeed procurement from big companies of small companies is an important part of this. There's a piece of work, and you'll see policies coming out on that procurement side of things as well. And it relies on infrastructure and it relies on skills. And our skills, yes, we need to grow our domestic skill base, but we are reliant on international skills. We always have been, we always will be. We've always been a country that's had an influx of academics and others from overseas, and that needs to continue. So the science and technology framework that was put together, which is a holistic way of going through this and saying, are we covering all the bases, I think is absolutely key to getting the industrial strategy right. Do all of these things, not assume that the odd one can make a difference, because at the end of the day, if you're a company, you care about what all of this means for you as a company. You don't care that one bit's sorted out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, brilliant. Lots there that I'm sure we will come back to in discussion. And so, on now to one of those companies, Johan, Reagan quipped that I'm from the government and I'm here to help are the 9 most terrifying words in the human language. But this government's growth plan is inherently based on the hope that they can help companies like you to invest more, and particularly in the UK. So what is it that they can do to help? Is it just about getting it out of the way, or are there specific active things they should be doing as well?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that we are very much encouraged by the direction taken by the government in terms of really putting a focus on life sciences, in terms of its opportunity to create value and also growth for UK, and for making it one of its prioritized sectors for growth. And I think they're right in doing so. I mean, life science today contributes already with almost 18 billion in terms of GVA. And the pharmaceutical sector, which I also represent, we are the largest contributor to UK R&D today, invested up to £9 billion in 2022. And a big part of that is industry-sponsored clinical trials, so direct investment into research and development, where we as a company have been one of the largest contributors over recent years, which adds significant value to the UK economy, but also to the NHS and to UK patients. And I think also, put simply, health is really wealth. I mean, what we do is that we research, we innovate, we develop medicines that actually help patients feel better, live longer, and stay out of the hospital, which I think is a prerequisite for growth for any nation. I think if I take a bit of a sort of step back and look at where UK life science is, I think we have an important opportunity now because we are at the crossroads. If we look at the global landscape, it is evolving. And if I look at where global boardrooms starts to take their decision, of course, the local environment where UK really has strengths in terms of innovation, talent, and science, we're not alone. And we're starting to look more broadly on the innovation environment when we take decisions. And we can see that countries like US that was referenced, but also China and Japan, they're taking the lead. And I think a fundamental challenge for UK, if we talk about conditions for companies, is the market conditions for the pharmaceutical space. We know that NHS spends approximately half of their healthcare cost into medicines versus countries like Germany, like France or Italy. We spend about 9, they spend about 17, which is already an underinvestment in the usage of medicines. And we know that reimbursed medicines, they are slow and inequitable in terms of how they reach patients, which is another problem. I think where we kind of have built now a burning platform for ourselves is also the recent VPAG rate, which is the sales tax that we essentially pay back to the government, which hit a record high in 23.5%, significantly higher than expected. And also, if you compare to other countries where similar schemes exist, like Germany and Ireland, we pay about 7 to 9%. Here it's 23.5%. And that makes it very difficult to build a strong investment case for the UK. But I think there are a lot of positives in terms of the direction forward. And as mentioned, what I think we need to see is a fundamental reform of the UK medicines environment and how that needs to play into the industrial strategy, the 10-year plan for NHS and the life science sector plan, to get out of this, I think, race to the bottom when it comes to medicines access, because I think the opportunity we have is significant. And we as a company are really committed to partnering with the Labour government in terms of finding constructive solutions to this, because UK has so much value to tap into.
Great, thank you very much. Giles, I'll come to you next. I don't think you'd find anyone in this room who probably disagree with the statement that we want more growth in science-based industries, and they've laid out from Patrick and Johan sort of some plausible ways forward there. But in industrial strategy, as in all kind of policy and politics, there are trade-offs. What do you see as the ones that bite here?
I mean, a useful sort of rule of thumb I apply when thinking about any policy idea is nothing can be easy and obvious and right. If it did, then it's already happened. So that trilemma. Now, if we all agree in this room, it's obviously right that we should have growth in science spending and growth in science industries. What is it that does not make it easy for politics? And some of these are... I mean, I jotted down dozens of different political concerns, and some of them have already been hinted at by Johan and Patrick. But for example, I mean, the most important driver of investment in any sort of business is the certainty of future demand. That's the strongest correlation you can see. And if that demand is uncertain or is impeded by taxes, then that will affect it. So the point that Johan made there is certainly incredibly relevant. Everyone who's sat down to make a business case, the most important line is the one at the top. What revenues am I going to get here? And the government needs to think about every way in which it might be affecting that procurement story. So another one is another classic trade-off, which is particularly important for science, is the one that Patrick referred to earlier about, which I just call openness. I mean, we all know that science is an incredibly international business, that the talent will be everywhere in the world, that being open to the talent from all over the world is what makes some of the great institutes and universities great. And that often involves the politicians just being firm, that whatever the sort of popular views about immigration, we need to have all the best talent coming here. If there's a vision for the future of the UK that will last 100 years, it has to be one about us being an entrepot that is open to the talents and finance of everything else. I mean, some of these will be specific political things that only politicians can do. I mean, I tend to think of politicians as things the civil service would need to invent if they didn't exist. And they need to invent them for things like taking political risks that civil servants are not authorised to do. A good classic one is, I mean, I've been told that one of the ways to attract a really great cluster of new knowledge is to go after really star academics. But star academics need really good pay. They are an international asset that can go in lots of places, but it takes a political call to say this person should be paid a high amount of money and we should be behind it. I mean, others that I would touch on. I mean, the fundamental dilemma, the reason I often sound slightly ambiguous about industrial strategy is the vast amount of complexity in it. That if you presented the politician with the full number of things that are in that science and technology framework that you must have helped write, Patrick. I remember once counting like 100 different intentions and commitments and policy ideas in it. The politicians need to be told where they need to focus on that. That is where the fundamental political challenge is behind all sorts of policy, that you can have brilliant ministers, and we've had many in the sort of science field before, but that you can't expect them to say all 100 of these bullet points are your to-do list. You need to work out where it can make the greatest difference to put political attention in, because we were discussing this in the green room earlier. Complexity is the biggest barrier to action nowadays. The fact that you take so many moving parts to deliver a policy area correctly. So I would say ultimately that's the big political call. Somebody at the beginning of these strategies should say, this is where we need the political attention, and that's where you're going to focus.
Brilliant, thanks, Giles. And one thing you touched on there, Giles, was the importance of people and talent. And Amanda, I'll come to you on that. We know science is a people-fueled business. So is the government doing everything it can to manage and enable that access to global talents?
Well, I mean, I'd pick up, first of all, I think we seem to have sort of violent agreement across the panel that the university sector is absolutely critical to the success of R&D, and then following on from that, growing our science-based industries. I think we obviously, we know we are an attractive place for global talent. You just have to look at the mix at some of our top universities. I mean, I can talk from the perspective of Imperial that we have 60% of our academics are international. So and that holds firm, and that's held firm through Brexit. So we know we're doing something right. But I think we have to think about what is actually attracting them, and how do we maintain that in what is an increasingly both a fiscally constrained environment, but also an increasingly complex geopolitical environment. So I think, we've talked a little bit about the funding mix, and I think it is really important to acknowledge that the UK's ecosystem is funded in a way that is quite unique. The quality-related, the QR funding that allows 10, 20, 30-year horizon of discovery research really genuinely is the envy of our colleagues in other countries around the world. And I think in my role, and if I talk to colleagues, we often feel we're constantly having to kind of make that point and defend that, and I wouldn't want to miss that opportunity here. That is where the next frontier discovery is going to come from, that's going to create the sector that we haven't even thought of yet. So I think that's going to be really important, and I think getting that funding mix right in the spending review is going to be really important. I think the other piece is actually to not forget the domestic pipeline. People come to the UK because we graduate fantastic students out of our schools, who then come and do STEM subjects at our universities and become the next early career researcher, the next kind of wave of research talent. That's something which I think we do need to be worried about. We are seeing a decline in students taking some of the STEM subjects at secondary level, which then feeds into that domestic pipeline coming through. And I think whether we get onto it in this conversation or not, I think that's something we have to look at. And I think universities like Imperial, we can do our bit. We have a maths school that we've opened in London. We're partnering with the University of Cumbria on a medical school. So we're trying to find ways to kind of, in our networks, to kind of build that STEM talent pipeline. But I think it's something that has to be, the system itself, it has to be looked at, and it might be something we come to later. I think the other thing we need to be doing is thinking about making it easy. I think the Chancellor said a few weeks ago, we're in a global competition for talent now. There's been a lot of talk about whether there's going to be moves from the US as a result of what's going on in their R&D ecosystem. So we do need to think about making ourselves attractive, but also easy to come to. And I think we've got some really good things in the system, but cost is becoming an issue of competitiveness. So when we do talk about visa surcharges, immigration health surcharges, these are increasingly becoming things that people do talk about needing some sort of reform, whether it's we look at how people make those payments. But I mean, just looking at, again, looking at our data, it's about £24,000 for a researcher to come with sort of a partner and 2 children up front to move to the UK. Now, we provide loans, but we're tapping, I think if you talk to universities across the UK, people are kind of tapping out on that. So it's something that is going to need to be looked at. Just lastly, I would just point out the graduate route, which I know has had a bit of attention over the last couple of weeks. It is a really important part of attracting great talent, talented students, particularly from countries like India, where we find there's some really fantastic students wanting to come to the UK. Yes, we want to make sure that people aren't abusing that system, but actually talking about entrepreneurial talent, we find a lot of our students who stay because of the graduate route is because they want to start companies. And they start successful companies, which might start at Imperial, but then grow and move to other parts of the UK. So we're very quickly contributing to the UK ecosystem. And then very finally, I think one thing we always talk about is, while we want to attract global talent to the UK, we also need to think about how global talent in academia now works. Science is so international. You can just as well access global talent through international partnerships, through collaborative mechanisms. So, I mean, we don't need to rehash the arguments for why we wanted so badly to reassociate Horizon, but it is these mechanisms, things like the International Science Partnerships Fund, which allow us to access global talent in country and really have that kind of flow of both people, but also ideas and innovation across from the UK out and from internationally back into the UK.
And you mentioned right at the start there that Vallance agreement across the panel about the importance of universities within this ecosystem. Obviously, every week there seem to be new stories about the financial challenges facing universities. How far do you think that is a risk to this kind of research and innovation growth agenda? I think
it's a very real risk. And I know that there's a lot of conversations, a lot of discussions within government about how we can try and solve what is a very complex funding system for UK higher education. But we know, I mean, you see the stories in the papers every day of different universities who perhaps people are surprised to find are in really quite dire financial circumstances. And I think going back to that point about the complexity and the uncertainty around the geopolitical situation, it wouldn't take much for something to really break the financial sustainability across the higher education system. There is a lot of cross-subsidy, as we know, from international students, funding research activities. This is a very delicate balance, and as I say, it wouldn't take much for that to be kind of properly thrown off.
And Lord Vallance, you mentioned how important it is that the industrial strategy focuses on all the different elements of this ecosystem and what affects businesses. So how far are some of the things that Amanda's been talking about, like access to global talent and so on, within scope of what the industrial strategy is thinking about with respect to life sciences and other advanced industries?
Well, they are in scope. I'm pick up on a couple of points. The first is that in thinking about how we allocate research funding, I just want to make it clear that I think there are three buckets that we need to think about. The first is curiosity-driven, basic, investigator-led research, which we need to accept as a country that we fund that with no expectation of a return to the economy in any parliamentary term. It's a long-term thing that in 10, 20, 30 years' time we'll be pleased we did. And we ought to be honest about that and not try and kid ourselves with made-up impact statements and other things. We don't know. And I think that area of research is one that ministers need to get their heads out of. It needs to be done by the people who know how to do it. But there's a second bucket, which is the more applied end of things, which should be much more aligned to government strategy. And the industrial strategy fits exactly there. There are things that need to be done that government wants to see happen. And we shouldn't be shy about saying, yes, there is research money, R&D money that's going into that space, which has outcomes that need to occur over a certain time frame and can help drive growth and public services and all the other things that we want to get done, including, of course, defence and security. And then there's a third bucket, which is the one related to companies, where we need to make sure the funding system supports company formation, supports the ability for them to get an initial sort of holding, and then the scale-up bit. So I think thinking about these funding blocks differently, I think is quite important. Otherwise, it just becomes a sort of a muddle point, and you end up damaging some of the things you want to protect, like the curiosity-driven research. Then I think in terms of the other points that were raised, of course, things like university sustainability are crucial to this. And of course, things like visas are crucial to this. We need to get this right. I said that we've always relied upon immigration of talent. We will always rely on immigration of talent. Therefore, we need to have systems. And we've got the global talent visa and various other schemes. We need to keep asking, is that sufficient for what we want to do? And if not, what we can make happen there. But that's why I come back to the 10 points in the S&T framework are a very good way of just going back and checking that you're actually doing the things in an integrated way. If you don't do that, then you don't actually solve the problem for the wealth creation that we need to do.
That's really interesting. One thing, Johan, that came out really strongly in your remarks is how there's a global marketplace, not just for people, but for investment as well. I'm interested in where is the UK kind of looking good in its international comparison, and where does it perhaps fall down?
So I think a bit what I mentioned, and again, building on what was said, I think the strength of the UK universities, the science and the talent that exists in the UK, I think really plays in its favor. So that stands out, but it starts to become even more competitive in that space as well. And then other factors comes into play when you make decisions on investments. And also the access to medicines in any given system is a critical element of, if we're going to do early research, co-create new assets in a given healthcare system, it's almost unethical to do so if we don't have a foreseeable future where these medicines actually get in the hands and homes of patients. So I think there's this element of strong science base, but it has to be coupled with the step of implementation, because that's where innovation really creates value for patients and for the system. So I think there's a lot historically in the UK. I think the NHS in its as a concept is very helpful. I think where we see challenges is how it's operating today, the level of fragmentation and the lack of, let's say, sort of strong national guidance in terms of how we implement what we say actually creates value in the system.
And Giles, I'm going to try and nail you down on some more, more specific policy prescription. But given the way that Lord Vallance has laid out those kind of different buckets of funding and this kind of concept of, I guess, the international environment of that competition.
Yeah.
What does that mean for where government should really be focusing in this? There are loads of things government could be doing or trying to achieve, but where is there really kind of big value add from government involvement on industrial strategy?
I mean, you're asking me to nail things down specifically, so I'm going to free ride on your implicit praise for earlier industrial strategies we've had. When we were designing the 2017 to 19/20 industrial strategy, one of the structures underneath it were the grand challenges. And this was meant to take on the idea that it's really hard to predict the future and you can't do much about that. And in fact, government, the last thing you need is politicians trying to second guess the market. So that's why you should never do industrial strategy. And we thought, no, hold it, Mo, there are some things about the future that we really know about. We are going to be decarbonising. We are going to be ageing as a society. We are going to be increasingly reliant on data and artificial intelligence as sort of foundations of other industries. And there's going to be a whole new way of moving people around using electric rather than sort of fossil fuel-based transport. So we thought these are the areas of very high certainty that you should be focusing on, because there's no way that in future you're going to turn around and say, well, it turned out we decided not to age. And in fact, I mean, although some countries might go back on their net zero commitments, we're definitely not going to. So I would say that if you were to choose where specifically to prioritise within, where are you going to get the greatest bang for your buck on that sort of limited political attention and capital that you have, I would say you want to pick those things that are absolutely certainly going to happen and where politics plays a really important role in coordinating the levers across. I think the absolute starring example is the transition to net zero, where we clearly have, I mean, there was an excellent piece I want to shout out for, BCG put out a great piece about the future investment needs that we've already committed to as a country. And the fact that we've got a real supply problem here. It's all very well laying out great big capital pipelines, but you need people, you need skills, and you need all sorts of coordination and finance in there. And we need, and some of this is caused by net zero, and we need to be coordinating those levers so that we do have the welders and the bricklayers and the people who have got expertise in transforming electric networks and so forth. So I would say pick those areas of high salience. The problem you've got, and we made this mistake in the Industrial Strategy 2017-19. People hear you say industrial strategy and they think that means you're open to every bright, virtuous idea that might come along. And they might all be great ideas. But to do that prioritization, you have to be able to say, that's fine, but we are focusing in this other place for now. And that's something I've never seen a government successfully do, I'm afraid.
A good challenge for this government. And one thing that Giles mentioned there was the sort of importance of infrastructure, and the Oxford-Cambridge Arc is one of the areas that you're working on at the moment. So how can the government overcome some of the barriers that have affected that and other projects in terms of actually developing the infrastructure and connections, which is one of those key areas that you highlighted as being so important in these industries?
Well, so the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor is a very obvious example, it seems to me. I mean, people have talked about it for 40 years.
Yeah.
And it's never been properly completed. And yet, I think everywhere around the world, people see the potential. They know that Oxford's great. They know that Cambridge is great. They know there's lots of good things going on in the middle in Milton Keynes and places as well. And the potential of joining that up is huge. I mean, it could really create very significant added value to the UK economy. So whilst not ignoring the need to get things elsewhere in the country, we should do this. And to do that means unblocking some of the things that have held up the ability to do it. It's not primarily about housing. It's not primarily about road transport or rail links. It's primarily about innovation and growth that comes from innovation. That will drive increased living standards. It will lead to better schools, better hospitals, better ability to fund things, better outlooks for future generations. So that's the basis for it, innovation to unleash that potential. In order to do that, we do need to get the houses, we do need to get the railway, we do need to sort out water supply, energy supply, and so on. So this is, I think, a very good example of a project where government needs to come together. It's several departments, and one of the things that I've done is to now pull together a cross-government team to try and hardwire the civil service a bit on this objective. Because if it's all left up to individual departments, it's never precisely the top of any one department's list. Mm-hmm. It'll slip down, but it is the top of what we need to do as a government in terms of getting this growth going. And that's why we're treating this as a project. And it's got many of the features of a true mission-based project. You know what it is you want to do, you know by when you want to do it, And it's difficult, but all the component parts are there, so you can do it. And so I think this is a chance to really show delivery. And the sooner we can start to show delivery against the quick wins, the sooner investment will come in. And I do believe this is the sort of thing that investors will be falling over themselves to come into if they believe that government is going to do it.
And Johan, do you agree that something like the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor is exactly what you would be looking for when you're thinking about when and where to invest in the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a strong infrastructure and connectedness within the ecosystem is extremely important. And that's also how we think about, how do we best partner with the healthcare system. It's with sort of research-based providers like Imperial, I think is a good example where we can really work end-to-end on that partnership. So the better we can enable that to make that more effective, I think is something that's absolutely critical.
Brilliant. Well, I know there are lots of people in the room and lots of questions already online, so I'm going to move now to Q&A. If you have questions in the room, do you want to raise your hands? Yeah, we'll start with the woman just there by the door, and then we'll come down here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Martha Hilton from UKRI. Thank you for the discussion so far. I want to comment a bit on the discussion around universities, how they're crucial to this kind of pipeline economic growth, but the vulnerable position that they are in at the moment due to the kind of balance, as you say, between international students supporting research, and also I think QR plays into that as well. However, I'm not sure the government are going to give universities any more money. The system kind of relies on universities applying for research which they know might cost more than they get for it. I guess my question is, what could we do as a sector, or what would you suggest to make the system more resilient and sustainable?
Thank you. A couple just down here. Yeah.
Thank you. Sean Walsh from Cancer Research UK. A lot to agree with in those reflections. I think we would echo the points around the increase in visa costs. It's a 44% increase for our centres and institutes at the moment. And Mr. Vallance really reflect positively on the work you've been doing around clusters, and we have our own report coming out on cancer research clusters very soon, which we'd love to talk to you about. My question, though, is reflecting on the wider environment and the press conference between President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer. And there was a reflection that Prime Minister Starmer made around the role that AI could play in curing cancer. And it seemed to be linked to wider discussions around trade agreements. And I was interested in the panel's view on the role that life sciences can play in both trade agreements, but also in bringing together stronger international collaboration when tariffs are the talk of the day, but collaboration is what we need.
Great, thank you. The next door and then behind will take this.
Hetty Barkworth-Nanton. I run an organisation called Ploughshare Innovations that takes science from government and spins it out, commercialises it. A really interesting debate so far. We have a diagnostic startup called Presymptom Health, which is just at the point now in the UK of kind of getting to first product. But it's very clear that if we want it to scale, it's going to need to go over to the US. And indeed, that's what investors over here say to us. Mm-hmm. And all of the reasons that have been articulated, I think, are part of the mix of that. But I wonder whether even with a super agile procurement in the NHS, whether the market in the UK is ever going to be big enough for these businesses to scale.
Right. I might just add to that a question, the most popular question online, which is that the UK is sometimes described as the best American research lab. Do US acquisitions of UK startups like DeepMind's and/or suppression of UK startups via anti-competitive practices threaten any industrial strategy? And we'll just take one more question behind you.
Hello, I'm Alicia Grated from CASE, the Campaign for Science and Engineering. Great discussion, and I want to say particular thanks to Amanda for raising upfront visa cost, which was going to be my question. We look into a lot of these areas, so I wanted to raise a couple of points that have come from our members. The first one is a very general question around, particularly probably for Patrick, around how we as a sector, an R&D sector, create a compelling case to government and voters about the importance of R&D given really very significant conflicting priorities, like how do I get a GP appointment, and the global context we've just heard about. So you said, this is really bad, I've forgotten your name, Giles, you said we'll definitely support net zero in the future. Great, but will we? So when you look at what's happening in the US, I think there's things that we never thought would happen that are happening. Secondly, we've talked a lot about STEM, especially the biosciences, obviously really important. We all agree with that. What has come from our analysis is the importance of the diversity of the research base. And what I mean by that is the diversity of disciplines. So not just STEM, but the importance of areas like social, legal, ethical research, if you take the topic AI, which just came up in the last question. And when we look at the universities and departments that are getting cut, they're probably the most vulnerable. So how do we continue to support and value the diversity of the research base in the UK?
Great, thank you. So a lot of questions there, and I'm not going to ask everyone on the panel to answer every one, but just to summarise, we've got the question about how universities can, what can they actually do in this current challenging circumstances, the question about the role of life sciences and trade agreements and potential for international collaboration, that challenge around scale-ups, which Patrick, you had already talked about, and then there's questions about creating a compelling case for R&D to government and the importance of diversity of the research base. So I'll start with Giles, take your pick, and we'll kind of move our way through.
There's normally the luxury of going first. You get 4 questions, you say, I'll just choose the one that's not impossible, but there isn't one. For making the university system more resilient, I do not know if there's a way around fees. As far as I can see, that when people talk about how fantastic the US system is, there's no way the US system would be fantastic with the level of fees that we have. So I'm sorry, that's a kind of non sort of political answer. But I do not know universities well enough to say there's a smarter way of running them even tighter, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone else can. Otherwise, I mean, on the case of making the voters' case for science funding, if I can think about that, it's on the whole, my albeit not particularly strong political record as a political special advisor, most voters do not care very deeply about most things. There's a few really big issues that move the whole, there's a sea change in public opinion around a few really massive issues like COVID lockdowns or what happened in the autumn of 2022 or Black Wednesday. And then mostly they're looking for politicians to show leadership. So politicians who stand up and say, this is what I believe in, which is a vision of the country as a technologically forward, science-based place. This is somewhere which we're going to be brilliant at. And they've delegated that decision to the scientists. So it should not be broken down into a tournament between spending on making the NHS work better this period and science spending, because that will always fail, as you must be more aware than I am from up here. It's about delegating the position to people who truly believe in it and then letting them take that decision. So I would say it's a way of questioning the question. I would say do not let it come down to a tournament between the two. It's a vision for the country as a future, once again, fast-growing place that will be able to fund those things, I hope.
Great, thanks. Amanda.
Well, again, I won't say too much about the fee situation. I've sort of spoken about it already. I mean, I think this is going to be a really, really difficult situation to solve. I think what we can think about doing is, we know international students are absolutely vital to the financial sustainability of the sector. So we need to think very carefully when we do things that may be discouraging the best international students from coming to the UK, unless we want to radically overhaul how our universities are funded. I think universities themselves, and I think if you talk to any university across the UK, are looking either at efficiencies themselves or how they may also de-risk some of that exposure, going back to some of those issues around geopolitics. So there are levers that universities themselves are trying to pull, but I think that there is just a wider conversation that is being had right now about the the financial viability of the sector as a whole. But I don't think there's going to be an easy answer unless you want to throw loads more money at the sector, which we know is just not going to be a viable option on its own. I did just want to pick up on the scale-up question, actually, because we get asked a lot about this. Obviously, we have a very strong entrepreneurial culture. We have a lot of scale-ups and spin-outs coming out of Imperial, and a lot of concern about where they're going to actually end up. And we have a lot which have gone out to the Bay Area because, for very good reason, it's either that's where they need to be to take the next step in the advancement of their particular technology, or that's where the investment is. So actually, I think we should be thinking more about what can we be doing here? How do we keep growing the innovation ecosystem in the UK? What's missing in the system? So I think there's things like the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, which are absolutely critical to kind of find where we can really build on things that we know can be really additive in the future. And it'd be wrong not to sort of mention that Imperial's got its West Tech Corridor, which is kind of running out through West London, which is really just doing exactly the same thing, looking at what the infrastructure developments we can be doing, which are going to crowd in innovation, which are going to support scale-ups. And the scale-ups that traditionally may have left, but actually if we put the right conditions in place here, can stay. So things like we've just purchased a large piece of land around Old Oak, where the HS2 station will hopefully come in one day. And the whole point of that is to provide follow-on space. So we have start-up and scale-up facilities on our White City campus. We need to develop, where do they go next? So once you've outgrown an incubator, where can you go to a facility to kind of scale up your battery technology or your engineering biology? That's where we're trying to sort of add into the ecosystem. So I think it's easy to sort of bemoan what America has, but actually what can we be doing in the UK and within the various innovation clusters to try and make it easier for companies to stay here? And just the only other thing I'd say is I think everyone in this room will know that obviously the venture capital in the UK is just not at the same maturity as what you're going to find in the Bay Area. So obviously we want to be attracting, and I have to say when we launched the West Tech Corridor, I was amazed at how many big US VC firms got in touch saying, well, this is interesting, let's have a conversation. And these are long conversations, but it demonstrated to me the interest in the UK system is still there, it's still strong. We've also launched with the Royal Academy of Engineering a venture capital fellowships program, which is trying to also educate and upskill the venture capital community that does exist in the UK in deep tech science. So what are the barriers to commercialization? And one of those barriers is actually knowledge and understanding of some of these technologies within the venture capital, within the VC community in the UK and in the investment community. So there's things we can be doing. And I think sometimes we should be focusing more on how do we continue to build our own innovation ecosystem, knowing that there is a behemoth over there in the US that will continue to attract some of our companies away.
Do you agree with that, Lord Vallance?
Well, I completely agree. I mean, I've said scaling several times. I mean, it's exactly what we need to focus on. We need to get more capital released from things like pension funds and other places. We need to have better skilled investors who understand the risk profile of these types of investments, because if you don't, then you end up in an even bigger mess. And we need to understand that it's a number of things, including clear, consistent procurement signals from government, which can be part of it, including regulatory approaches which allow people to scale in an easy way, and the skills that we need to do it. So there's a whole host of things that need to come together, and the government's very focused on doing that, because if we can fix that scaling problem, it won't be 100%. We'll always have companies that go to the States and elsewhere, but we can be much better than we are, and that's the route to sustained growth from S&T. And if we don't have science and technology companies growing in this country, then we cannot get above average growth. That's why this is such a crucial part of what needs to happen. I mean, just to pick on a couple of other points, on AI and cancer, I think it's worth reflecting that the most striking advances in AI application are actually in science. And I think we're going to see that continue over the next period. I mean, they really are astonishing if you look at what's happened. And in terms of, can science be a precursor to a trade agreement? Yes. I think that's really important, because where you get those relationships built, it becomes easier to do trade agreements. So I think that is a really important part of what we need to think about. I just touch on the diversity of subject question as well. It's worth reflecting that as universities, and by the way, the university problem is not a UK-specific problem. If you look around the world, universities everywhere are in difficulty. So there are questions like student fees, overseas student numbers, full economic costing, inflation that have all been pressures, but they're not the root cause of the problem. It's worth reflecting on that. But what we are seeing is what some of us are old enough to remember happened 30 or so years ago, which is selective subjects are being affected. And you're right, arts, humanities, social sciences, some of them, but chemistry is again one of the subjects that looks as though departments are under pressure. It's very, very important that we don't end up with a system which has got skewed towards subjects which happen to be popular today, but actually don't give us the needs of the future. And I think that's going to be one of the things as we look at university sustainability, how we also ensure that across what is an independent system, because universities are independent, we have a view on what the subjects are that we must make sure we keep and grow.
And Johan?
Yeah, maybe just quickly on the scale up. I think what would it take to make UK really attractive to actually have companies staying and flourishing here? I think you look at US, it's difficult to argue that you wouldn't go there, size of market and the opportunity. But if we can create an environment here which is fast from a regulatory point of view, we can create agility, we can create this opportunity to really sort of be a sandbox that is self-sustainable in a way, because we're fast, agile, we can learn, we can fail, and we can move on quickly. And then of course we can scale in the US at the same time, but it doesn't have to be this either or dilemma, which I think is what we just have to reflect on as a country, like what is our unique value proposition to those companies? And it has to be that we can do something here which you cannot do in the US. And then maybe on the sort of the globalization aspect, maybe a quick comment. I think if I look again from the global lens, US is typically seen in life science as the big innovator. Europe is the big regulator. I mean, UK has an opportunity, I think, to play kind of in a unique space where we actually can, tap into all the great strengths that we have, but in a way that we're not necessarily held back by everything that Europe wants to regulate, and we can actually create something that is different and lean into that position, which I think also could be a differentiating value proposition for us versus other, let's say, decisions when it comes to investments.
Great. I'm just going to take a few questions online, and there'll be time for one or two more in the room. So the top voted question now online is from Jenny Andrew from Prospect Union, who says, today's Guardian reports that the UK has dropped in the rankings of women's equality in the workplace. What will it take for economic growth in traditionally male-dominated STEM sectors to move gender equality forward rather than backwards? And a linked question from Simon Webb, how can we help children, especially girls, include science at age 14, 15? In a narrow choice of A or T levels, around 35% of engineers in Spain are women versus 15% in Britain. And then an anonymous question, are there specific skills areas that represent pinch points the panellists are particularly concerned about that might limit growth? So maybe just do some brief answers on those. I'll start with you, Johan, and work the other way.
I mean, on the diversity element, if I look at our workforce, it's incredibly diverse, and we have, a female representation that outnumbers male representation. And I think that's extremely important for us also in having a workforce that really reflects the patients and the diversity of the system that we try to serve. So I think that's a critical element. And if I look also at the creativity and the, let's say, the dynamics within the workforce, it has to come from that type of diversity. So it requires a long-term strategy. I think that's clear. But I think if I look at the reality that we have, we are quite diverse from a sort of workforce composition perspective.
Okay. Lord Vallance?
Well, I make one general comment, which is the need for diversity is not something that's a nice to have. It's absolutely central. I mean, you can't make good decisions if you don't have diverse groups, and that's true in startups that need a range of skills, range of degree backgrounds in order to do it. It's true in every decision. And so I think we have to see diversity as a central growth strategy, because it enables you to do things that otherwise you wouldn't. And if you look across the sciences, I mean, biological sciences, actually the gender balance is now pretty good. It's not good in many of the physical sciences. It remains poor. Royal Academy of Engineering, I think, did a really good push on women in engineering, and it did make a difference, but nowhere near to the level that's been described in Spain yet. And there is something about the way in which we force subject choices, which I think is quite important, both at A level and at university level, which I think is something that could be part of thinking about how to deal with this, because we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't get this right.
Amanda, you alluded to some of these issues earlier in the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think I actually just fully support what's just been said about the need for diversity. I mean, one of the reasons we want to have it's really important to us to have a diverse classroom in our various subjects. And look, I think Imperial, because we are a STEM only, STEM and business school only university, it's been you can sort of track that development as those numbers have ticked up, but it's taken a lot of hard work. It's a lot of work making sure that we're getting diversity coming through STEM subjects in secondary school, which then feeds into admissions. And then when obviously students from diverse backgrounds come to the university, we need to make sure that they are properly supported and are able to really thrive on campus. And I think that's been something that, I wouldn't say this is unique to Imperial, but I'm sure other universities are very conscious of that at the same time. And actually, just to pick up on one point there, it's been really important to us that a lot of our entrepreneurial activity is open and that women are encouraged and supported to participate in it. And we do have women-only innovation programs and competitions, but they've sort of moved on so that we now have, they need to be women-led, so they can be mixed teams, but they will have a female founder or a female leader as part of that team. So, these programs can evolve, but they've been very successful at really pushing up the number of our female students who are getting involved in entrepreneurial activity, which leads, as we said, you do get a different perspective and different ideas flowing through. So I think it's absolutely critical.
Giles, do you want to come in briefly, or should I run on to final questions?
I don't have much to add. I'll just say that the pinch points question, I think the panel has mentioned quite a few already, and it does vary by system, but it's land use around the greater southeast, and that's what is being addressed with this corridor. The one that we kept hearing in Downing Street 5 or 6 years ago was maths students. You just want more maths students. You need to start that pipeline really young if you want to provide the sort of workers of the future. But no, I think we've covered it.
Thank you. We have time, I think, for one more question, so we'll go for the man in the back there. Sorry, everyone else.
Chris Smythe from The Times. Just to follow up the point about AI, when politicians often talk about AI in a slightly cargo cultish way. If you just say it enough, growth will descend from the sky. What in practice does the government need to do to ensure that it does contribute to economic growth? Where is that going to be the case, and where is it, I guess, not? I mean, you talked about sciences. Are there trade-offs that we're going to have to accept there? How does the government think about that as it is negotiating this deal with the US?
Great. I think in the last 5 minutes, the panel can tackle that nice, easy question. Giles, do you want to start?
How to deal with the cargo cult that is the AI? I would say, look, through history, the major advantages from all technologies are in its use, not its invention. So the basic answer is what matters is deploying AI where it can make the greatest difference. The earlier iterations we've seen, these large language models, it's improving the efficiency of administration would be. So the obvious lowest hanging fruit is the way the government works and how it can operate. But as Patrick has alluded earlier, we're at early stages for its deployment in science and already seeing fantastic results, like through AlphaFold, in developing the shapes of proteins and so forth. But while I believe we have great strengths as a country as a producer, as shown by the fact that DeepMind started here and we have sort of great centres of expertise, it is in its use and deployment that it will make the bigger difference to productivity.
Okay. Amanda?
I might come at this from a slightly different angle, which is, I think one of the reasons, one of the ways that we're going to actually see our AI properly deliver is actually we need to upskill our policymakers across Westminster and Whitehall so that they can really actually understand. And I am not an expert in AI, so I consider myself in this category, to really understand what the opportunities are, what the risks are, and how we can most effectively deploy it both across government sectors, but also how we can unlock its potential for either new sectors or in traditional sectors, which just are very slow at being able to adopt the benefits. So there are lots of programs going on, but we have a number of programs with fellowships with senior civil servants. We're doing AI fundamentals courses for junior civil servants. We have a Centre for Sectoral Economic Performance, which does boot camps across key technologies. So I think this is where the universities can actually really lean in to try and upskill the knowledge and the expertise within policy making, and I think increasingly across industry as well. I mean, the pace of change is so great that you can't afford not to get yourself up to speed on the potential for AI, or else it is just it remains a buzzword for so many people who are they know it could be a game changer, but it's just not clear how. So I think we all have a job here to really try and increase the level of understanding and knowledge so people can feel they are taking part in some of these discussions in a really meaningful way and fully understand how they might unlock productivity across different sectors in the UK.
What about?
Yeah, well, I mean, the sort of glib answer to that, Chris, is the AI Opportunities Action Plan, which was laid out very clearly with 50 recommendations as to what needs to be done to try and drive this. But I'll pick on a couple of things. I mean, I think the adoption of technology is crucial. We know we have a long tail of low productivity in this country, and we have very low uptake of technology in that long tail. So there's definitely an opportunity there, and shift the whole curve towards more productivity. And I think the second point is, I think as we look at AI, it's really important that we ask the question, what is it that only humans can do, and move towards more time. And you can see in medicine how that's crucial, that there are some things that AI can do, like reading scans, reading pathology slides, and so on. And there are things where people actually need human-to-human interaction in order to heal. And I think we need to be smart about how to do that. And in the public sector, I was speaking to a team recently that's asked the question, if you do a public consultation and you get 150,000 different replies, can you use AI to actually work out what the themes and the things are in those consultations, which you clearly can? And their initial estimate was something like a 1,000-fold reduction in time taken to analyse and a 400-fold reduction in cost. Well, there are opportunities like that all over the place to look at.
Great. And final word to you, Johan.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I mean, in terms of applied AI, that's already a fact in research in terms of identifying novel disease targets or candidates for therapeutics, development about how we optimize patient recruitment in clinical trials, for example. But if I think locally from a government point of view, where there's real opportunity for the UK, I think it's the other aspect of AI, and that's the data it works on. And I think making an effort to get structured and validated health data that you can integrate across the systems, that we can leverage AI to do real-time decision making. I mean, the number of patients that go through NHS on a daily basis, they all provide a learning. What if we can start to integrate that and help, drive national guidelines, patient phenotypes into real-time decision making, or better understand what's the value of a given intervention to make sure we actually get to that productivity in the system, which is not always the case today.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid we're now at time, so sorry to those in the audience and online who still had further questions. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to Novartis Pharmaceuticals for making this fascinating discussion possible, and thank you to all of my panel as well.